This is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church in the community of Tull outside Benton with your devotion taken from the book of Hebrews chapter 11 beginning with verse 8. Tonight we're going to take a look at the example of faith as lived out in the life of Abraham. And with all the other examples that are given in chapter 11, we find that everything started with two key words: by faith. Abraham achieved what he was able to achieve, and he completed his mission in life by beginning it with the two-word phrase, by faith. The first thing, and we have to ask ourselves the question is, well, what is it that Abraham accomplished by his faith? And when you take a look at verse 8, the one thing that we know is that he went to a destination that he was uncertain of what he was going to find along the journey, but he was also uncertain about where it was going to take him. But yet that did not stop him from going. That's the one thing we know about the faith of Abraham, that he was determined to go wherever God told him to go, and he did not worry about the details before he initiated the action to go. You know, if we knew everything about the journey of life, and if we knew everything about what we were going to experience to our ultimate destination, we really wouldn't need faith. In fact, you couldn't even call it faith. You could call it self-reliance, you could call it self-dependency, you could call it a lot of things, but you could not call it faith, because Abraham put himself in a position where he was totally dependent upon God, being uncertain of what the journey would hold, and being uncertain about what he would find when he got to where God was going to take him. But yet that did not stop him from initiating the action to go. In fact, as you go on and you read the verses, it says that he obeyed and that he went. Faith, obedience, and action are all interlinked. They all depend upon each other and to prove each other, in order to prove each other. Faith, obedience, and action are dependent in order to show God that we are serious when we say that we're willing to do something by faith, but also to prove the world that is looking at us just like the world looked at Noah as he was building the ark, in order to prove that we are a people of faith, and that sometimes we go where other people do not understand why we're going there, and why we do things that we do without having the answers to all the questions before we initiate the action. But that is our way of showing the world that we are people of faith. And going back to what we said about Noah, in doing it, we will condemn the world, that while the world may cast its criticism toward us, we can remain focused and we can remain determined to do what God has called us to do, even if it's to go in a place and in a direction that we may be unfamiliar with, knowing that God will guide us and protect us along the way until he gets us to where he wants us to go. What did Abraham do by faith? The next thing is, we see that he did not set up residency here on earth. Verse 9 tells us that he knew he was going to live in tents. It also tells us that he kept his eyes beyond this life, because he knew of a place that was referenced in verse 10 and verses 13 through 16. He knew that there was something better even than what God had led him to here on this earth. And the one thing we know about Abraham was that he never became entrenched in this life, and he never became entrenched in everything that is entailed in this life. That he knew that there was one more destination, there was one more stop to complete the journey. And yet he showed his obedience by faith, that he followed God where he wanted him to go, but he was never content to stay there, because he was always thinking about heaven, and he was always thinking about what was going to come. The next thing we find that Abraham did by faith is that he viewed God as faithful in verse 11. I know we think about Abraham, and we think about Enoch, and we think about Abel, and we think about Noah, and we think about how they are people of faith. But the one thing you read in verse 11 is that Abraham recognized that God was a God of faith as well. We always think about how that faith is something that we're supposed to do, something that we're supposed to initiate. But you know, God responds to that, because one thing Abraham pointed out was that God also was faithful. In fact, when you look at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7 and verse 9, the Bible says, "Know therefore that the Lord your God is God. He is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations of those who love him and keep his commands." You know, Abraham experienced that. He experienced what it was like to serve a God who is faithful. He understood what it was like to serve a God who is not asking something of Abraham that he himself was not willing to give. He was also a God of faith. He wanted Abraham to be a faithful servant, but he was going to be a faithful God to Abraham. In the book of Psalm, chapter 89 and verse 1, the Bible says, "I will sing of the Lord's great love forever. With my mouth I will make your faithfulness known to all generations." Here we are, many generations after Abraham, but yet his faithfulness is still speaking to us. Why? Because he served a God who is faithful. And the thing we can know as God's children is that if we put our faith in God, we're not putting our faith in a God who does not respond to our faithfulness, because even he himself is faithful. The other thing we know that Abraham benefited from, or that he showed us as far as his faith, is that he defeated the appearance of death. In verse 12a, that's what the verse says. Now the world had assumed that Abraham and that Sarah were well beyond childbearing years. And maybe that is true, but that is the power of God, and that is how God rewards faithfulness. Abraham never gave up on the fact that God had promised him a son, and that he would promise him an inheritance of a son who would help the generations beyond him go on to 1,000 generations, and would become as the sands of the seas, and would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And while it is that the world may have appeared Abraham's opportunity to be dead, Abraham did not listen to the world, but instead he trusted and put his faith in God that at the appropriate time God would deliver on his promise, and he did. The world sometimes views what we do as dead. The world sometimes views us as being limited in what we're able to do. But when you serve a God who is faithful, and you put your faith in a God who is faithful, there are no limitations placed on God. He is an unlimited God who will fulfill his promise. We find that in the latter part of verse 12, we find that because of Abraham's faithfulness, he was able to create a legacy greater than himself. Referencing what I said a while ago, that he had a generation that was as numerous as the stars in the sky, and it was beyond measuring as the sands of the sea. And because he was faithful, it created the opportunity for him to leave a legacy that we're still talking about even today. What else was Abraham able to do by his faith? He passed the test, as mentioned in verses 17 through 19. God did not build his faith by tempting him. God built Abraham's faith by testing him. God is not the tempter. That is Satan, and that's what Satan does. He tempts us. But God will test us in order to build our faith, but also to develop our faith. We find that he says in James chapter 1, verses 3 through 4, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete and not lacking anything. And that described Abraham to a T. His faith was mature because God was testing him and developing him and bringing him along in his faith. And the last thing we know about what Abraham was able to do because of his faith is found in the last verse of Abraham's account. It says, because he reasoned, and he reasoned with an attitude of faith. Abraham was able to reason with the Lord. The Bible says, come now, let us reason together. But it also says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 21, but test everything, hold fast what is good. Abraham passed the test, and he was not afraid to pass or to take the test that God was going to give him, because he was holding on to everything good that he knew about a God who was a faithful God, and he knew that he would deliver on his promise. When we reach the place that we believe that God is going to deliver on his promise, whether bringing us to a destination here on earth or ultimately taking to our destination of a city whose foundation is laid by God, as referenced in these verses, that's when we will really show our faith to God, who is always faithful to us.